Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dan Slater. I'm the director of WCED. Thanks so much for attending our final public event of this most draining and difficult academic year. We've decided to add today's emergency roundtable to our schedule, Zoom fatigue notwithstanding, because the rhetoric of violent intimidation and the reality of voter suppression represent a genuine democratic emergency in America's states, not least right here in Michigan. We've been very fortunate to assemble a remarkable set of experts on very short notice, given the gravity of the current situation. Please allow me to briefly introduce our roundtable experts and then step aside until Q&A. Jenna Bednar is the Edie and Goldenberg Endowed Director for the Michigan and Washington Program, Professor of Political Science and Public Policy, and Research Professor at the Center for Political Studies and Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. Her most recent book, The Robust Federation, demonstrates how complementary institutions maintain and adjust the distribution of authority between national and state governments. Jenna, I must say, was the brainchild for this emergency event, and she knows more about the American states than I could ever dream to know. So she's agreed to moderate the discussion among the participants in addition to offering her own remarks. Alexandra Filindra is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She specializes in American immigration policy, immigration decisions, racial prejudice, and its effects on policy preferences, public opinion, political psychology, and survey research. Her current book project is entitled Race, Rights, and Rifles, Ascriptive Republicanism and the Debate Over Guns in America. Jake Grumbach is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Washington. His research focuses broadly on the political economy of the United States. His book project, based on his award-winning dissertation, investigates the causes and consequences of the nationalization of state politics since the 1970s. Danielle McGuire is an award-winning author and historian of the African-American freedom struggle. Her first book, At the Dark End of the Street, won the Frederick Jackson Turner Award from the Organization of American Historians and the Lillian Smith Book Award. Her next book, Murder in the Motor City, the 1967 Detroit Riot and American Injustice, will also be published by Knopf. Last but not least, Rob Mickey is Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies of Political Science at the University of Michigan. His research focuses on US politics and historical perspective. He's interested in American political development, political parties, racial politics, and policy responses to inequality. His forthcoming book explores the post-war US South as a set of transitions from authoritarian rule. And with that, we obviously have a lot of expertise on the panel, and I will turn things over to my colleague Jenna Bednar to kick off the conversation.
Dan, thank you. Thank you so much for agreeing to host this panel. Throughout the pandemic, as a scholar of federalism, I have to say I've been thrilled that people have suddenly discovered federalism and have strong opinions about it for and against. And so that's been a lot of fun. But lately, our conversation has taken a darker turn, and there's been concern about the robustness of democracy in the American states. And as we all know, as the American states go, given that they run our elections, so goes the American democracy. And so I have to say, Dan, that I never would have dreamed to be hosting a panel on democracy in the US states through the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. I always thought of what you did over there as being something very far flung from what we do here in the United States, and yet here we are. And so I'm looking forward very much to this conversation and thrilled that to be joined by such esteemed colleagues with such interesting backgrounds and knowledge to share. So with that, I thought I'd just get us started with inviting you all one by one to kind of share with us, give us a sense of your research perspective and how that gives us a way of thinking about what's happening now. So I guess the real question is, what do you have your eyes on in terms of movements to suppress votes in the United States? And how should we be thinking about that? How should we make sense of that? And I don't know, Rob, would you like to kick us off there?
Sure. So I guess I see what's happening now as actually about a 2-decade-long intentional weakening of democracy in the states. that's accelerated and intensified over this past year. What's strange about it when talking about democracy at the state level is that I think this is really a national movement with national actors who just happen to act subnationally, a point made really well by Professor Grumbach in his research. It's a partisan project, and until maybe this year, an elite project. And the engine is really state legislators, Republican state legislators, who are kind of steeped in a newly highly nationalized party competition, and who are backed up by national networks of, at least of activists who maybe are not committed to democracy, but who are ironically really good at democracy. So I'm thinking here of like Americans for Prosperity, the Koch Group, American Legislative Exchange Council, and so on. President Trump's conduct last year, and most important, I think, the acquiescence to his conduct by almost all Republican office holders has intensified this project and given it what it never had before in the last 20 years of attempts to kind of chip away at the liberalization of voting rights, and that is a mass base. No one was in the streets demanding voter suppression, right? It was really the events from November on that are maybe giving this a mass base, which is alarming. I'll let other people talk, of course, but I just note that while this started out in the late 90s and early 2000s as an effort to make it more difficult for likely Democratic voters to vote, it's expanded to the degradation of institutions that are accountable to the public, principally by insulating them from popular influence, especially when they're Democratic statewide officers. So tying the hands of officials that are now in Democratic hands. But maybe most alarmingly going on now is the partisanization of the actual count of votes. So conversely, not weakening officials who are accountable to the public, but kind of partisanizing officials who shouldn't be accountable to the public. And by that, I mean county and state election officials. So with that, let me finally shut up and let someone else talk.
We will pick back up on some of these things, but I think you've actually queued up Jake really well here. So Jake, you want to tell us a little bit about what you're working on and what you're seeing?
Absolutely, thanks. And I think that's exactly right. This was set up perfectly, both by your introduction, Professor Bednar, the idea that the states are where democracy lives and dies in the US. The US has an extremely decentralized form of federalism compared to even other federal institutional structures around the world, like Germany or Mexico, which means that the state level really controls democratic institutions that with respect to electoral democracy, so districting for legislative districts, voter registration, how long it takes somebody to wait in a line at a physical polling place, whether they can vote by mail, voter registration purges, whether ex-felons can vote, and so many other key features of electoral democracy, as well as we also care about sort of freedom, liberal democracy, and states also control policing and how sort of authoritarian one's life is and their experience with agents of the state. So the state level is really the front line of democracy. And a number of historical scholars have made the accurate point that the US, given the persistence of Jim Crow in the US South, wasn't really a full democracy really until the enforcement of the Voting Rights Act by the national government after 1965. And Professor Mickey's book suggests, that sort of battle over enforcement goes into the 70s, right? And then we saw the consolidation of American electoral democracy in the ensuing years and the expansion of voter access through especially the 1990s. But more recently, we've seen the polarization of these democratic institutions at the state level. And my research is right now really focused on measuring democratic performance in the states. And we see that like Rob just said, this is really a new story where compared to Jim Crow, which was really about battles within states and within localities around racial hierarchy, land redistribution, public goods, and the franchise and so forth. This is really the story of a national party that's unfortunately currently a coalition of a sort of elite group that for reasons of wealth does not have great interests in expanding democracy because their wealth may be redistributed. And then an electoral base that's really now newly mobilized against the idea of multiracial democracy in the US. So you combine the sort of both racial attitudes and reasons with sort of economic reasons, and you get a real national force that is causing democratic backsliding in the states that you can really observe. There's no real way to get this, you know, we in quantitative political science do a lot of what we call robustness checks, and there's no way to make that sort of treatment effect go away of when the Republican Party controls a state in the contemporary period, it's gonna restrict the franchise. We'll talk about further how there are some sort of bipartisan problems in state level democracy in some ways, especially around policing and mass incarceration and authoritarianism. But in electoral democracy, we're really seeing that when the Republican Party takes hold of a state, it's gonna restrict principles of electoral democracy.
Thank you, Jake. Danielle, I'm wondering if you want to jump in here and share some of your work.
Sure. I mean, you know, when you asked in the beginning, how are we thinking about this? You know, I primarily go back to the post-Reconstruction period and the rise of redemption from 1890 to 1910, 1920. And I think that a lot of people are calling what's happening right now, these 253 bills throughout the United States, 41 states to restrict voting as a kind of Jim Crow 2.0. And I think they're right, but I think it's a mistake to only think about it as race-based or as designed to just limit Black voters, while it is designed to do that for sure, just as Jim Crow 1.0 was designed to do. I think it's important that we remember that the establishment of Jim Crow, the disfranchisement campaigns that began in 1890, were designed to limit all kinds of voters, particularly Republican voters, populists, populist Republican coalitions, and of course, African Americans who were newly freed. Well, not newly freed, I guess they've been freed for 20 or 30 years, but part of a Democratic coalition, little d Democratic coalition. And the Democratic Party sought one party authoritarian rule. And in order to do that, they started to limit the vote to all kinds of people with a profound and devastating effect, of course, on African Americans. So we see that same kind of effort now. Not only to limit Black voting rights, but to try to limit access to the vote by college students, by young people, by people in urban centers, by working class people and others. Of course, it's designed to secure another kind of one-party, nationalistic, authoritarian rule. And you can see, if you take, you know, both what Rob, Mickey said and what Jake said, and look at it in a whole, you can see the ways in which this really is a kind of Jim Crow 2.0, right? A way to elevate one party in a hyper-partisan system and to limit the votes of everyone who might upset that party, right? Or weaken it or loosen its control. And so not only are they trying to increase laws that make it difficult to help voters, to penalize anyone who's trying to assist voters, either if it's carrying an absentee ballot to the polls, if it's handing out food and water or anything like that, but they're also trying to do similar things, I think, to what they did in the 1890s and 1910s. And in that sense, they're really trying to create, like I said, a one-party state in lots of places. And you can see how that becomes very problematic very quickly. You know, the Jim Crow laws were not racist on their face, right? They were written and designed in a race neutral way. They probably even would have used the same language that they're using now, you know, voter integrity rules, understanding clauses. You know, we don't want anyone to vote, as a recent Arizona representative put it. They would have said that in the 1890s. We want people who understand the Constitution to vote, who can read well, who can pass a literacy test, who can pay a poll tax, who can do all kinds of things. We're seeing very, very, very similar bills being resurrected now and designed to do the same thing. So what I see, what scares me the most is that we forget, or we don't know, how all of these little efforts to chip away at people's suffrage rights led to an authoritarian system where not only could, the majority of African Americans not vote and participate in society, but they couldn't do much of anything else. They couldn't petition courts for justice or redress. The local party would appoint the coroner so they could let lynch mobs get away with vigilante violence. They could appoint the local police chief who could do whatever he or she wanted. It was he's then. And so on and so forth. So you end up with an apartheid authoritarian state, and it's creepy. And I think we need to fight really hard against it. This is not something that happened overnight, right? This is an ongoing project that is accelerated and will continue to accelerate given the hyperpartisanship, the lies and conspiracies that have grown enormously online and social media, and are amplified by accelerationists on the right and by national parties. Wow.
Yeah, and so you brought up at the very end a bit about rhetoric, and I think we want to examine that. We've been seeing an increase in rhetoric around violence, and which creates kind of a normalization of it. And Alexandra, I think this really is a great moment for us to turn to you and lean on you for your work on violence and the relationship between violence and our democratic rights.
Exactly, Jenna. The focus here, and rightly so, has been on voter restrictions, which is a pattern we see internationally. But what I look at, which is far more of an American tradition, is the laws that allow for the proliferation of civilian-owned, higher-powered firearms, and thus the potential of violence, not only in private spaces, but in public spaces, and the cultural foundations of these developments. What we saw in Michigan in the summer of 2020 was basically a bunch of heavily armed, mostly white, mostly male protesters who showed up to protest the governor's public health measures. And in other states, more ominously even, we saw these armed groups appear as self-appointed police auxiliaries, as Danielle said, kind of vigilante groups at BLM protests. And for many of us who study guns, this drove home the realization that there's something really seriously going wrong here, because at the intersection of the First and the Second Amendment, it's a very dangerous place to be. Politics is about managing disagreement and conflict through deliberation and contestation, through processes. Guns in political contexts can be detrimental to the political process. And the proximate cause of the armed protest phenomenon is the liberalization of state gun laws, including laws that allow open carry of firearms in public spaces. And this has been facilitated by two Supreme Court decisions recently that basically elevated the right to bear arms into an individual fundamental right that the states cannot regulate and infringe in various ways. As a result, states have had to harmonize their laws downward and remove barriers to ownership, and many went much further than that. But as much as such laws has enabled people to show up armed at protests, these laws do not explain why people would want to do this and what this form of political engagement signifies. That these laws also do not explain why is it primarily white men, and as my research shows, especially whites who express high levels of anti-Black attitudes, who show this high level of enthusiasm for firearms and the Second Amendment. So what my research shows is that for many people, gun ownership and gun carry is tied to an understanding of what good citizenship is about. It is a way to project that you are a member in good standing of the polity, that for many of these people actually see themselves as protecting the public good and standing guard against the enemies of American institutions. And in a sense, for them, this is a public duty, that they understand it as public service and not simply as an individualistic or materialistic act of just owning something. This relationship has a very long history in America, and it goes back to the revolution. Today, we tend to associate the revolution with narratives about classical liberalism and freedom, but another very prominent tradition of the era was the civic Republican tradition. And what Republicans understood as virtuous citizenship in terms of it was political engagement and readiness to serve with arms, to be ready to serve in the military, in a sense. And this tradition was incorporated in America's political and military institutions. It was the militia, or what we know today as the National Guard, that became the central sort of incorporation of this tradition. And at the same time, this Republican tradition incorporated American beliefs about gender and race. It wasn't just anybody who could be a citizen, right? Black people were believed to be dependent and unsuitable for Republican citizenship, and women did not have the physical or mental capacity to serve at arms, and therefore were not suited for citizenship. And it is important here to note that actually both African Americans and women, both white and Black women, have borne arms and have fought in almost every American war in different capacities. And as Danielle's work shows, actually, it was instrumental. It was very important for women in the civil rights movement to be armed against white vigilantes. What people are not aware of is that the NRA, which is a key political player in all of this today, and a big promoter of this idea that links citizenship and gun ownership, has actually was a product of the National Guard. And it was a quasi-governmental organization whose role was to improve the shooting skills of draft-aged men. And basically, even today, it built its membership through this link to the federal government and through this link to the military. And the vast majority of NRA members today who are associated with this gun culture are white men. And what they promote is this understanding of arms as a form of citizenship and of an obligation. Is a modern manifestation, if you will, of this Republican culture that was built on the assumption that only white men could be virtuous citizens. And this is a very dangerous manifestation of politics today, an understanding of the political community and the polity that goes against contemporary understandings of a diverse society.
So this is just fascinating, and I really appreciate that, Alexandra. You're getting us to think about, so much of the attention right now is on legislation that's been introduced. You're getting us to think much more broadly about the political context, some extra institutional processes, and the beliefs. Really, it comes down to the beliefs that we have about what it means to be a citizen, and what we should expect from our institutions and the way that we support them. And maybe I'll just jump in here and share a little bit about the way that I think about, or some things that are have caught my attention and the way I've been thinking about them, because I think in a way it complements really well some of the stuff that Alexandra was just describing. So maybe I'll start by talking about institutional loopholes. So come right back to procedure, and we think about ordinary legislation and those being perhaps threats to the operation of democracy. But the legislative process is really complex and varies from state to state. Here in Michigan, it's particularly complex because we're one of the, I think it's 26 states that have some form of direct democracy. We have a pretty rich tradition of direct democracy. And one one thing that's a little bit counterintuitive about our direct democracy and the way that the Michigan Constitution lays it out is it does enable our legislature in a funny way to have more power vis-a-vis the governor. So and this is relevant right now, is there's a set of, so here in Michigan, for those who are tuning in from elsewhere, we have a Republican, we're a 50-50 state. It's a very exciting state to study because the politics are super rich. And the legislature is Republican dominated, and we have a Democratic governor. So there are a set of bills that is being introduced into the legislature that would be what members of this panel would and others would qualify as being democracy suppressing. That is, it's just making it a little bit more difficult to vote. If I could get into some of the details of it, things like absentee ballots have to be dropped off by 5 p.m. the day before the election, some kind of little rules. I like to think about legislation as something that we take on to solve problems. The set of proposals here, it's kind of difficult to identify exactly what problem they're designed to solve. Anyway, nothing has happened quite yet, but there is speculation that should the legislature pass these bills, that the governor would veto them as being out of sync with where the people of Michigan are, given that in 2018, the citizens of Michigan voted in some proposals that were ballot measures that were democracy expanding, including much greater access to, much greater access to absentee voting. All right, so anyway, what can happen is to counter this threat of a veto, the legislature can, or the party can coordinate a petition from the public, as if it were generating a petition for something that could become an initiative to appear on the ballot. And these petitions, in order to be considered, require some percentage of the last gubernatorial vote, something like 10% of the last gubernatorial vote. So it's, I think, somewhere in the realm of 350,000 signatures you need to collect. It's a lot of signatures. It's expensive to collect, but it's not insurmountable. So with this number of signatures, the Michigan Constitution allows the legislature to say, that's a great idea. Tell you what, we'll vote on it and accept it rather than put it on the ballot. And in that case, with that procedure, it doesn't become subject to the possibility of a gubernatorial veto. So it's a way of circumventing the governor. So, and this has been done in the past, by the way, and not just when we've had a split between party representation in the governor and the legislature, because the legislature, a Republican-controlled legislature, did this to circumvent Governor Snyder, who was a Republican, veto over, I think it was restrictive abortion procedures. So this, I raise this and say that it reminds me in a sense of some of the things that Alexandra was talking about, because you say, well, I mean, this is perfectly legitimate according to the institutional procedures that we have in place, but it feels a little bit undemocratic. It's legal, absolutely legal. But for this, as with so many other institutions, these formal rules that we have, they are subject to our own approval, in a sense. That is, we could say, we disapprove of that, and we're going to vote in a way that shows that we disapprove of that. So we could ultimately say, threaten as voters, if we could organize ourselves, to say, we will not vote into office public officials who would follow this kind of procedure. Or we could say, with rhetoric, if we wanted to punish public officials for the rhetoric that they use. We have those tools technically, right? It's just, how do you organize that among the public? Where does this confidence and this belief come from? So it becomes kind of a war for ideas to capture the attention. Like, okay, now people who are on this call know about this loophole that exists, but did you know about it before? And you are all highly informed people. And I'm not just talking to the people I can see on the screen, but those who bother to tune in to a Zoom on with a conversation like this, you are highly informed people. Did you know about this loophole? And do you have confidence that you understand how everybody else feels about the loophole and is willing to behave in a way that when you vote is going to change a legislator's willingness to behave in this way? Okay, so you see that when we rely on norms, which democracy does, it's so fragile and it's so dependent on what we can glean from the beliefs that others have. And so I'll just say one more thing and then open it back up, because the other thing that's really caught my eye is over the last decade, but increasingly over the last electoral cycle, we've had businesses, corporations, and organizations entering into the political fray and expressing values, acting in ways that kind of reinforce our democratic norms. These corporations are standing up for democracy. We had, in response to the Georgia proposed legislation, Delta and Coca-Cola came out with statements, and then the public was like, that's not strong enough. And then they revised their statements, right? The MLB has removed was it the playoffs that it was going to hold in Atlanta in response. And then we have the governor of Texas yesterday stepping in and saying, that's it, I'm no longer going to throw at the first pitch in the Texas Rangers game, this little tit for tat. But we have these corporations and organizations entering into this sphere of creating this dialogue amongst the public about what we really care about as a democracy, and acting in a way to reinforce our democratic norms, to create what we call common knowledge about it. That is, if the NBA, if the NCAA, if MLB, if Delta, if Coca-Cola says we have to stand up for democracy, then we individual citizens can start to have confidence that other people share the same view. So, we talk about cancel culture or virtue signaling. Virtue signaling is used dismissively, but I think that's exactly what's going on. And we kind of have to, if we're going to create this common knowledge about what our democratic norms are, if we're going to be able to defend them. All right. At this point, I have some more things I want to take us toward, looking toward the future and where it's all headed. But I thought I'd give you all a chance, if you want to jump in response to something that has come up, of many amazing ideas that have come up. So, Alexandra.
I mean, one prior question, I agree. First of all, I think it's fascinating, but kind of, to me, it's disconcerting that these companies are taking these positions and are becoming political citizens, and they're projecting political citizenship. But aside of that discussion, do we have a good prior understanding? Do we have a common understanding of what democracy is in the American public, and what Americans across the board accept and want as democracy? And take the example of guns. I mean, it's a prime example. Is it democratically acceptable to have people participate in the public square outside their homes and outside of protecting your domestic castle, but actual in political activity, bring in firearms. Is that consistent with understandings of democracy? And the answer is depends who you're asking. Because for some people, and especially people who come out of the insurrectionist tradition of the NRA, and it's a very venerable, long-standing tradition, this is what we're supposed to do. Americans are supposed to be ready to defend their values with arms. And they take it very literally in a very specific modern way, but they sort of draw on political understandings of democracy that are not totally superficial. There is something important undergirding this. And then there are other understandings of democracy coming out of the European and Weberian tradition that would say, you know, if you don't have governmental control of the ability to use force, then really bad things can happen. You have a very weak state, and you cannot have a democracy that protects rights when individuals can use their arms to make decisions in the political realm. So what is democracy for the American people? How do they define it? And on the basis of that, you know, we need to have that discussion first before we see how loopholes and institutions work. What is our underlying political culture here?
If there even is a singular definition. Jake.
Thanks. I don't know if Rob was going to jump into this. Is great. A lot on the table here. So the first thing, I think, going back to Jenna's initial point there. So in many political societies, but especially in the US, we were unaware of sort of over the past decade, how much is governed by norms rather than formal institutional rules. That's within the national government around Supreme Court appointments, at the state level around, sending electoral college votes to Washington from state legislature, so many things like this, gerrymandering and districting, so many things are governed by norms rather than rules, and those norms have certainly eroded, and it's made us more aware of real sort of gaps within the American institutional structure, and things we assume to be formal rules were actually governed by just norms that like we're barely holding on by threads of sort of historical happenstance. Not exactly, so that's very important to update these rules around democratic institutions and sort of power sharing within state governments and the national government. That's absolutely right. One example is this Michigan constitutional loophole that Jenna mentioned. In addition, when we think about these firms getting involved, this is also really important to think historically, where these firms are certainly guided by profit making now, and there's been somewhat of a realignment where higher income urbanites are now Democrats, and that's a main consumer base for these firms. And the real sad fact that Alexandra kind of implied here, the sad fact is that these firms may be currently more responsive to urban, upper middle and higher income people than legislative institutions due to districting and the clustering of these sort of middle upper income Democratic voters in cities. That means that state legislatures are not going to be responsive to those clustered voters, as opposed to the sort of naturally perfectly gerrymandered exurban and rural voters, plus formal gerrymandering makes this an even more extreme sort of tilt of legislative responsiveness. So then the irony is, like, Delta Airlines says, oh, we care about those suburban Atlanta people who can really spend money. But that doesn't mean this is either that firms are acting out of morality or principled commitments to democracy. In fact, they actually spent the last generation empowering this anti-democratic coalition. And then now when there's a sort of realignment of upper income people, they get to switch and then be seen as these corporate socially responsible corporate actors. So it's really, they're playing every side perfectly. So this is not out of morality. And also we must realize that empowering these firms is not healthy for democracy, that their main democratic force they've done over the past generation is really to hold back expansion of the American welfare state when super majorities of voters across parties. So one really important thing I mentioned about the National Republican Party is that the base is not interested in the high-end tax cuts and cuts to social welfare programs that the sort of elite Republican Party is. If you remember, the two major policy items by the Trump administration were an attempted rollback of the Affordable Care Act and high-end tax cuts that are sort of record-breaking. Neither of those are really supported by the Republican base. Supermajorities, including of Republicans, enjoy our sort of united around economic issues and generally to the left of the median legislator. That's totally the opposite in social identity cleavages in society. I say now, you can tell much more about how somebody votes based on their views of Colin Kaepernick and the NFL protests than you can about how they feel about health insurance or the minimum wage and things like that. This means that firms are actually, while right now in terms of electoral democratic institutions, they're seizing a political advantage to come out on sort of the right side here, given this change in their sort of consumer partisan profiles. But that overall, this more submerged power of firms is really counter-majoritarian. And then the last thing I'll just say that I think Alexandra just brought out so brilliantly is that notions of sort of political legitimacy, of democracy and small r republicanism, these are really, many of these orientations point against the belief that majorities matter. So when we talk about small d democracy, Robert Dahl, the famous political scientist and theorist, it's really about responsiveness to majorities of citizens based in one person, one vote. There's so many institutions in the American political system that are counter-majoritarian in these ways, the Senate being kind of the flagship one, but also the Supreme Court. So many, there's so many veto points in counter-majoritarian institutions, but the belief that there are certain political citizens that are legitimate political citizens, and that is based in, and there are certain political citizens that are illegitimate. And we've seen not only, so there's a long tradition of not considering Black Americans as legitimate political players. That's a very long tradition, but now it overlaps with things like geography. When you hear the will of the people from some political actors, they're talking about not people who live in cities, right? We see this in Michigan too. Like, don't let Detroit and Ann Arbor like tell you the real citizens what to do. And that's a new thing. That's it's related to historical traditions, but this is really crucial that we think about sort of majoritarianism in American democracy.
Danielle, I was just about to call on you, and so I want you to say whatever you were about to say, but then also because I'm thinking that it's a good moment to think about where all this is headed, and really the first two people I want to hear from on this are our two historians, right? You and Rob. So because looking to the past to understand trends. So help us think about where this is headed.
Yeah, just to build on what Jake was saying, I was a vote counter, or actually a poll challenger at the TCF Center in Detroit on Election Day. And so I was one of the many people there who was watching poll inspectors, count ballots. And
wait, Danielle, just for a moment, just for those who are tuning in from outside of Michigan, let them know why we all think of, TCF causes us to think in a certain way. So what happened?
So, TCF is a huge conference center. There were hundreds of polling centers there to do absentee counting of the ballots. So we were all in one big room, different polling sites together, but in their own little, rectangles, counting absentee votes. And each party was allowed to have inspectors or poll watchers there to observe the count. And so were other interested parties like ACLU and different nonprofit voting related groups. I was there as a trained representative of the Democratic Party. I was partnered with the former assistant attorney general, who, we were both just there as volunteers, soccer moms actually. And it was the first time I'd ever done anything like that. And it was absolutely incredible watching how many checks and balances there were in counting a single ballot. I mean, absolutely impossible to have any kind of like mass voter fraud. It was just obvious, each ballot passed through 10 different hands, 2 or 3 different checkpoints. And that was just, in that one polling site at the TCF Center, and it had already gone through a number of checks and balances before it even got there. So when we arrived, we had been trained for 2 or 3 days. We knew a bunch of the rules, what we could and what we couldn't do, how to challenge, how not to challenge, who we could speak to, not the election ballot counters, but their supervisors only. And our counterparts in the Republican Party came in without knowing the rules. They had not been trained. They had only been trained to look for suspicious things. And so we came with very different sort of starting points. I came with sort of an awe for democracy and just this incredible sense of citizen action in, security of our ballot and how really cool that was. And my counterparts who were there as poll watchers for the GOP came to find fraud. And the problem was that because they didn't understand how everything was being done, they didn't understand the rules, they hadn't been trained, everything that they didn't understand became cause for suspicion and alleged fraud. And throughout the day, every time they broke a rule or talked to someone they weren't supposed to, a supervisor would come to them, they'd file an affidavit saying they were harassed. And throughout the day, you could just see the way a narrative was being built about their victimization and what they were doing, when really what they were there was to cause chaos and harass the counters. It was shocking to see, and it was shocking to see in real time. And almost all of the people that were there in Detroit, in the heart of Detroit, as poll watchers were white, like me, and I thought that had a very interesting cast, right? Here were a whole lot of white people looking over the shoulders of mostly Black poll inspectors, counting ballots and raising questions and concerns about them, many of whom didn't actually know the rules and didn't know what they were doing. So it was fascinating to see. But what it taught me was that when you come in with the wrong set of assumptions, all kinds of stories can be twisted out of proportion, and they were. And, hundreds of affidavits were filed that were almost completely bogus and nonsense, which was proven in the courts again and again and again throughout the country. And yet a majority of people in Michigan and around the country who identify as Republicans believe the things that they heard happened at places like TCF, that there were hidden ballots, that there were military ballots that were being swiped for votes for Joe Biden, because everyone knows, only military people vote Republican exclusively, right? Even Black voters from Detroit who are in the military vote Republican, allegedly. They think they found ballots in empty boxes, and they weren't ballots in empty boxes. The boxes were empty, or they thought a food delivery was secret army of voter ballot thieves bringing in fake ballots to the TCF Center. The stories go on, and the real issue is that so many people believe them, all the way up to our state legislators, so much that they wanted to overthrow the election in Michigan. And what I learned through the whole process was how fragile it really is. With the exception of 2 or 3 people on both the Wayne County Board of Canvassers and then the State Board of Canvassers, there could have been a real constitutional crisis in Michigan. And the legal and valid votes of the citizens of this state could have been overthrown by a hyper-partisan, conspiratorial, demonstrably false campaign by the Republican Party. And some of the laws that they're passing in Georgia will allow them to do the things they sought to do, which is, you don't like what Brad Raffensperger said in Georgia? Well, we'll kick him out. he won't have that power anymore. Or we don't like that Aaron Langeveld, the Republican state board of canvasser, voted with the Democrats in Michigan. Guess what? He's not on the board anymore. And now someone who believed all the lies is. So I think that we're still on the precipice of a very dangerous anti-democratic movement. And if history has anything to teach us, it teaches us that these kinds of movements towards authoritarian nationalists, one party, apartheid-like states, like what we saw during Jim Crow, take time. Disfranchisement happened over the span of 20 to 30 years. And we're in the middle of that now. These things don't happen overnight. I know it feels like an emergency. It's kind of been an emergency, and it will continue to be. At the same time that there is this retrenchment and fight against voter enlargement, voter expansion, there is a subsequent civil rights movement that's going on that we've seen that is really powerful, and that at least last summer was one of the largest we've seen in the United States. That crossed that crossed age, gender, race, class, and it was really phenomenal. So I think we're on the verge of another kind of redemption. We're in another kind of redemption, but we're also in another kind of major civil rights movement as well.
Right. So two forces, right? Rob, help us think about, from your perspective, where is this headed?
Sure. So that means I have to talk about the past because that's what I do. Let me just know one thing though, that I don't have anything clever to say about it, but I think we need to acknowledge it. And that's that, in my view, at least, there's a current paradox where voting rights are facing their biggest threat since probably the 1970s through the actions of the federal court since the Shelby County decision 2013, some decisions in front of the court now that involve perhaps weakening Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So voting rights are really vulnerable right now. And yet at the very same time, it's never been easier to vote in America for everybody, right? It's much easier to vote now than it was in 1990s. And that's principally because of the liberalization of voter registration rules, really the biggest barrier to voting. And also early voting, right? A lot of the bills that are that Republican legislatures are either considering or passing now involve cutting back on early voting, but we have to note, oh my God, there's early voting, right? That's an incredibly novel thing, right? In 1996, something like 90% of people voted on election day. By 2016, that was down to 60%. It was like 45% last year. And I think also a lot of voters got a good taste in their mouths of voting by mail, absentee voting. So they'll be pressured to do even more of that. So again, I don't know what to make of this, but I just want to note that one of the things that makes this moment, this emergency, both just hard to think through is this paradox. Okay, so wait, did I use up all my time?
No.
Okay, because none of that was about the past. Okay, so I guess the way I think about, when I think about the next 2 decades, I think back about the past, and for about a half century, we've been going through a shift in terms of which party houses America's most anti-democratic forces. For 140 years, it was the Democratic Party that safeguarded this anti-democratic faction. Only in the 1970s that started changing, in part, ironically, I think, because of the democratization of the South. That helped nationalize politics. It helped nationalize the way racial conflict affected voting. And there was another ironic cost of the democratization of the South, and that is it stripped away an important insulation that used to protect us from hyper-partisanship and polarization, and that is the fact that it used to be, until very recently, state party competition differed from national party competition. State parties talked about different things. The elections were about different matters. But now we just have this relentless nationalization of everything, right? This changed in the 1970s because part of destroying the Jim Crow South, controlled by one party, Democratic Party rule, was state party reforms that said, no state parties, you can't decide who votes in our primaries anymore. No more white primary, no more hidden secret meetings about who can be a presidential convention delegate and so on. Nationalization politics is just terrible in a lot of ways. You know, elections are just too high stakes. I mean, Ann Arbor is weird, of course, but you know, people disagree with each other on who should be elected to the city council based on the city councilor's views on Bernie Sanders, as if the Ann Arbor city government has anything to do with large downward redistribution. Everything is nationalized, and I think that's why you see these national level forces working hard to win more at the state level. And as Jake was saying, the problem here isn't that necessarily that we have a cluster of Americans. I mean, it is a problem, but US democracy isn't necessarily imperiled by the fact that there's a large faction of Americans and American organized interests who are anti-democratic. That's common in many democracies. What I think's dangerous now is that now that faction is inside the party less supportive of redistribution. So with skyrocketing economic inequality, wealthy Americans have kind of radicalized, moved much more in a libertarian manner than they used to on taxes and regulation. And so the problem is that party, the more conservative party, has an agenda, as Jake was saying, that's not just unpopular among American voters. A lot of the things that are most important to them, taxes, regulation, scrapping the Affordable Care Act, are unpopular even among American Republican voters, right? So the party, even this libertarian strand of the party, right? The Koch brothers love immigration. They want labor to be cheaper, right? Even this wing of the party, given the fact that it wants to win with an unpopular agenda, is backing things like voter suppression at the state level and also fighting HR 1 in Congress, as is going on right now. It's certainly true that this is not brand new at the national level. The founder of the Heritage Foundation and the co-founder of ALEC, Paul Weyrich, gave a famous speech in, I think, 1980 saying, we win elections when not everybody can vote, and we need to work harder at that. So a lot of what's happening now has nothing to do with Trump. It's the fruition of a lot of hard work. I guess when I'm looking ahead to the future, I'm thinking that the US really has to kind of weather the storm, a good QAnon phrase, of the next 2 decades while we're waiting for the demographic composition of the electorate to catch up with the demographic trends in the population. In other words, a much larger share of the electorate being non-white. I think we really need to think about what we need to do defensively to guard democracy, especially for the next 20 years.
Right, because in places in Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia where Blacks held the majority, that didn't matter, right? Once they had secured one party rule through disfranchisement campaigns and everything that accompanied them, it didn't matter who was in the majority in the population.
Good point.
Absolutely. Just continuing
Jake,
on.
why don't you, this is really setting you up very well, so why don't you take over?
No, I want to, I think there's a ton to dig into here, which is so great. I think, so Rob mentions that voting on average is more accessible than potentially a generation ago. I think that's right. So when we think about the Motor Voter Act, the national policy of 1990 to expand voter registration in DMVs across the country. That combined with the breakdown of a lot of Jim Crow regimes really was powerful. So North Carolina is such an interesting case here where it was a leader in implementing the Motor Voter Act. Its old school Jim Crow one-party state was breaking down. And by the way, these sort of democratic sort of neo-segregationist democratic wings controlled state legislatures until the 90s and 2000s in the US South. It's really this sort of realignment racially and in terms of civil rights orientation of the parties at the state level took a lot longer. Places like Mississippi and Arkansas, their state legislatures were sort of these racially conservative democratic legislators until the 90s and 2000s. But a place like North Carolina was becoming more accessible. Voter turnout was, up 10 percentage points in a decade. It was like an entire transformation of state level democracy. But as happens in American historical patterns, it's really just iconic in American history where Danielle mentioned Reconstruction. When there's a move towards multiracial democracy, Reconstruction being the most important one in American history to bring true democracy throughout the United States, the first attempt at a multiracial democracy, really actually to some extent across the world, the true sort of establishment of a multiracial democracy. There's a massive backlash in the form of white domestic terrorism and Jim Crow more broadly. And then more recently, the breakdown of the Jim Crow regimes resulted in the expansion of democracy and then again, a sort of backlash that we've seen over a longer period of time than so the manifestation of this crisis is January 6th, the insurrection at the US Capitol. It's absolutely important to remember. At the same time, the roots of that crisis had been sown in the states. The seeds had been sown, don't mix those metaphors, for decades. And importantly, I think it's really important to remember when we talk about the stop the steal sort of conspiracies about, there must be fraudulent undocumented immigrant votes. There must be urban voter fraud by Black voters in cities. There must be these sort of city machines that are doing corrupt dealings with votes. All of that is those are long-term, that's a long-term mythos that's been in this sort of anti-multiracial democracy coalition, whatever party it's in. And when we think about even the tremendous moderate maverick, John McCain, that we like to, that was when the Republican Party stood for democracy. But that was actually, his entire campaign was centered around voter fraud by Black voters due to Acorn. And that was an entire, massive conspiracy during that time that really implicated the idea was right there in the late 2000s about Black voters fraudulently voting, and it got sort of integrated into the narrative of this is how the first Black president got elected, was through mass voter fraud by Black and brown people at the behest of some often globalist, conspiracies. So this goes back really far, and this was playing with fire that now has started a massive blaze throughout the political system. And we can't forget that. We cannot re-empower those coalitions that sowed the seeds of this democratic crisis.
Really quick, can I just say, I think that you're describing it perfectly. And, the end of Reconstruction came with a nexus of other political movements, anti-immigration, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, vigilantism and domestic terrorism, as you mentioned, an increase in misdemeanors and felonies related to voting or almost anything else that could put people in a category where they could no longer vote. Anti-union efforts, right, and suppression, violent suppression of unions, privatization of public services, whether it's education or municipalities or militaries. And we're seeing the exact same kind of nexus of movements now that are contributing to this anti-democratic movement and this kind of rise in vigilantism and terrorism that is totally embodied by January 6th and what happened there.
And in some ways, it goes back to who is a citizen, who's a good citizen, and who embodies the values of the American tradition, and what are those values? We are fundamentally at a point where these two value systems are clashing again, and we are seeing people who are saying, you are not like us. You are not real citizens in some fundamental cultural way, and we need to keep you out. Like, I was watching conservative channels this morning, and they constantly talk about the people. And it's a contestation between the people and the Democrats, which tells you that the people is a different quantity than the Democrats. And the Democrats are not the people, they're not the citizens. And there is some fundamental disconnect about who is part of this polity, and who should be and who deserves to be, and who represents the ideal citizen. What qualities does that person have to have? And the Democrat is not it. So we need to sort of really look at the culture here, because I'm a Roger Smith accolade. So, and basically think about where this is coming from, and how do people understand democracy and citizenship. And we know this from a historical perspective and from a legal perspective. We have theories about different definitions of citizenship, but we also need to do more work on the public and really get a better understanding of how the American public understands these things. We already see that conceptions of democracy and support for democracy is clearly context dependent. There are several studies that show that, experimental studies, including work that I'm doing, that basically you put people in a context that they don't like, or you give them questions that they don't like, whether it is in the partisan context or in the racial context. If they're faced, for example, with demands for change from minority groups, they're very happy to backlash and support non-democratic institutional change, and basically backlash on democratic values. We already are establishing this, but we need to also understand, how do they understand, what do they mean by democracy? What do people understand by democratic values, and who do they understand to be a citizen? What qualities does a citizen have? And how does that differ by party, by race, by region, by urban and rural? Like, all of these things, we don't have necessarily a good grasp of the richness of that tableau.
Alexandra, I'm going to stay with you for a second. I guess I have a follow-up question for you. So it seems that what you're describing is a set of US citizens who believe that gun ownership and arm bearing in public is patriotic, and not just patriotic, but important for the functioning of our democracy. And then we haven't talked about the other set of people, but they also exist, who believe that you can't have arms anywhere near the democratic process, because that pollutes it, that corrupts it. And so what do you see in your research about these trends? And do you think that we, for example, should expect to see more displays of arms in public places, even in political places like we had last year in the Michigan State Legislature gallery, public gallery? Should we expect to see more like what happened on January 6th with the insurrection, the attack on Congress? That is, should we expect to see much more violence in our political space?
My answer is yes, different forms, not necessarily of actualized violence, but of projected violence. absolutely. Like, I don't expect too many insurrection-like incidents because I hope that institutions now have learned and they are more likely to guard against these things. But it is worthwhile to compare the events in Michigan in May compared to January at the Capitol, because what happened in Michigan was quite extraordinary, because you had like hundreds of people with really big arms barging into the state capitol and entering the legislative chambers. And actually the guards let them through because it is their constitutional right to bring these arms into the Capitol. But if you had an umbrella or you didn't have arms with you, you had to go through the metal detector because you could have a knife, which is quite extraordinary as a form of political theater. But yes, from my perspective, I believe that there's going to be more expressions of armed protestation and bringing arms to political events as an expression of, superior moral citizenship. I am the real citizen and I am projecting that kind of, my value system. And this goes back, well, Reconstruction is a good time to sort of compare this to in some ways, or even the post-Reconstruction era had a lot of this. But there is a very long tradition of this. And Rob, I think you wanted to address this too.
Just on the question of violence, I agree with that. During the Johnson administration in the late 60s, the senior staffers wrote each other memos in the fall and winter of each year saying, what should we do to prepare for next summer's riots? And I kind of feel that way about this summer, right? We had this unbelievable, as Danielle mentioned, this unbelievable flourishing of democracy in the form of the summer of protests and rallies. But, save for a few awful examples like what happened in Wisconsin, that was before we had a lot of people who had joined this new kind of militarized insurrection movement. So I'm really worried about when those forces clash during this summer's protests, right? I also worry, a lot, getting back to one thing you said, Jenna, things get very complicated in states that have a Democratic, say a Democratic governor, and then much more likely a Republican legislature because of gerrymandering, because you could imagine that there'd be a lot of pressure on those Democratic governors not to deter or repress white nationalist political violence in particular ways. So we can imagine like Biden having to, federalize the National Guard in some places like Eisenhower did. So I'm kind of, I'm thinking about this summer and I'm quite worried about what's going to happen.
And to actually add to that, already we have seen some quite disconcerting cases like Ron DeSantis in Florida, who suggested that he wants to extend stand your ground laws to cover basically shooting people in protest if you think that somebody's property is under threat, that sort of a stand your ground would cover you if you shot people. So what happened in Kenosha essentially would be justified violence, which is going at levels of justifying vigilantism institutionally in ways that actually the post-Reconstruction era didn't do. Like they did it through courts and they did it through informal procedures, but they didn't actually pass laws to institutionalize vigilantism in the same way, which is astounding.
I think those laws go along with laws that are trying to be, that legislatures are trying to pass to penalize protesting.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
determine, to call them riots as opposed to peaceful protests that are okay under the First Amendment. And that's particularly in Florida too, but elsewhere as well. And that goes along then if you're charged with a felony for protesting police violence, then guess what? In a lot of places you can't vote. And if your felon rights, if your right to vote has been removed by the legislature, like it was in Florida, well, then you have to pay a poll tax to vote or restitution for your time in jail. So there's just so many layers of suppression and oppression here that are fundamentally anti-Black, but also just anti-democratic.
Okay, this is an amazing conversation. I know we have some audience questions, but maybe before we get to them, I can ask you all this because you've got me worried. So how worried should we all be about this health of the American democracy? Is it robust? Or we know it's fragile, right? Do you think that it's failing? And I'm not going to call on anyone. I want you to go ahead and speak.
I'll jump in. So yeah, I'm currently in a pessimistic few years about my sense of the health of American democracy, and just building on what everyone has said. So I think people, my co-panelist colleagues, have focused to some extent on sort of conspiratorial beliefs amongst the base, sort of radicalization, armed movements and things like that. So there's this danger. There's really a danger of political elites for the past generation who have stoked these forms of belief in terms of sort of discussing the illegitimacy of their political opponents, promoting more apocalyptic terms, nationalizing politics in terms of this sociocultural conflict that's really devoid of any policy content. So it makes politics about sort of national identity cleavages in much more dangerous ways. There's so many key issues here, but I want to say just there's not much one can do technocratically to change beliefs within some committed base around armed insurrection and things like that. What I think we can do is attempt to reinvigorate civic organizations that really connect people to their material political circumstances and give them some buy-in in state, local, and national politics in a way that produces policy responses to socioeconomic problems they face in their lives and connects them to politics rather than to an apocalyptic struggle between classes of civilizational cultures. And I think the key things to do with that, there's been a generations-long push to dismantle those civic organizations, most notably the labor movement, which my own research shows really reduces racial conflict among workers and produces a greater interracial solidarity, as well as informing people about public policy and how their life fits into that in all these complicated policy issues that through the American federalism system are so really hard to track. So I think a reinvigoration of groups on college campuses, civic organizations, and really the labor movement are going to be key. And there's not really some sort of fix like, we can inject true beliefs about the lack of electoral fraud. It's just unfortunately not a very viable strategy. So we really need to think about mobilizing counter organizations that can connect people to politics in their own lives in ways that are not sort of about the fundamental collapse of their own identity if the out party were to take power in their state.
I am with Jake in many ways. I don't think that in a two-party system, it is possible to maintain a healthy democracy when one party has rejected democratic rules and democratic culture. It has become a win at all costs party without any ideology, without any program really. In that environment, especially in a two-party system, you don't have a choice. Like for people who want a more conservative party, there isn't anything else. So it is far more problematic here than it is in many parts of Europe, where you have authoritarian parties. Like in Greece, you have the Golden Dawn, but the Golden Dawn is a small party and can be kept peripheral. In the US, it's one of the two major parties with 40% of the people. So that is one key problem. Another problem is the fact that our educational system has failed and is continuing to fail. And here's where I'll go anti-democratic, and I think we should basically take democracy out of education and give it to some technocrats to actually set up curriculum about what is more appropriate for students to have, and basically encourage people, improve our public schools and encourage people to attend public schools rather than to educate kids in at home or take private school routes. And there's huge benefits to public education, and we need to revitalize our public education system and also desegregate it again, because it has become even more segregated than it was like in the 60s in some ways. So we really need to have a discussion about education and spending on education, especially primary and secondary education. We're failing our kids, and we're failing them in understanding civics and understanding how the political system works. We need to do more on that if we want to have a more robust democracy.
Danielle?
Well, I've been scared for a long time, and it's not a healthy emotional state to be in, I think. And I've also been countered that fear and sense of doom with a sense of hope and powerfulness that's rooted in, I think, citizen action. As a civil rights historian, I can't help but quote one of the greatest political theorists of our time, Ella Baker, who believed that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary change, and showed that that was possible through the student movements of the 1960s, particularly SNCC. The best way to see the weaknesses of our democracy, and there are many, is from the standpoint of the margins, right? And that's also where the most hopeful resistance movements are as well. And so I think there's plenty of organizations to be involved with that are doing this work really well and working hard to build coalitions. And that's where we all need to be if we want to have hope for the future, and if we want to beat back Jim Crow 2.0.
Rob, do you have any thoughts on this?
You're muted, Rob.
I feel like I've talked too much. Can I cede my time to Jake or Dan or you or somebody?
I mean, I guess I would say out of this that actually, to continue what Danielle was just saying, we can't wait for this to be solved by someone else. It has to be solved by us, by all of us. And to me, one of the most promising things that I saw in this last electoral cycle is the number of people who were talking about how important democracy is, and then taking action on it, like Danielle, who went and volunteered for the first time as a poll worker. I tried and couldn't get in because all the spots were taken. And that was exciting, right? So we are first we're talking about it, which, back to my conversation about norms, it reinforces this. And then it is leading us to action. And then I'd like to just get back to what Jake was saying, because this is something that I'm starting to work on as well, is, again, we can't wait for things to miraculously change. We have to restitch our social fabric ourselves. And a way to do that is through these organizations, participating in these organizations that construct our civil society, that cause us to be connected with one another, and include others so that we are all participating in the reconstruction of our social fabric. So that's what I see as how can we get out of this mess? Because I'm with Danielle, it's really not healthy to be scared. And so at this point, I think with just 2 minutes left, I'm going to turn it over to Dan, see if there's any points he wants to raise, and anything he wants to say about anything that's come up.
Well, it's been a remarkable conversation. So just thank you all, I would say, for taking the time and to bring these insights to bear, historical, contemporary, future oriented. I especially want to thank our three guests from outside University of Michigan. So Alexandra, Filindra, and Danielle McGuire and Jake Grumbach. I mean, really remarkable insights and a great conversation. And then my colleagues Rob Mickey and Jenna Bednar, who just did an amazing job, I think, of moderating, bringing this whole conversation together. It's really been sobering in a lot of ways, but I think it's the kind of conversation we need to have. Even an emergency that takes time to unfold is still very much an emergency, and we're certainly in one, both locally, nationally, globally. And so we're kind of from WCED's perspective, we're at the end of the academic year. It's been a very hard year with the pandemic. I think the kind of participation that Danielle and Jenna were talking about, that sense of civic ties, that sense of togetherness has really been frayed, and it's really going to be hard to regenerate in a lot of ways. But the urgency of it really seems abundantly clear. We're this pandemic isn't letting go. Michigan is having the worst outbreak in the country right now. So everyone's just gotta sit tight a while longer. But again, thanks so much everybody for coming out. It's been, I think, a really good year of programs at WCED. Hopefully everybody will take a look at the things that we have put together on democracy emerging, democracy submerging, both in America and overseas. And we really, really look forward to being back in person again next year. Hopefully we'll be getting through this and we'll be able to meet in person again. And until then, hopefully everybody will be safe. Everybody will do their part in trying to keep America on track, or get us back on tracks as best as we possibly can. So thanks again to Jenna, Rob, Danielle, Alexandra, Jake. Really remarkable session. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.